So if people are very concerned about where and how can we better explain things to customers, that's a big flag that they're asking the wrong questions. Because if that's the question you're preoccupied by, that means that you really haven't understood what is actually salient, what's actually important to customers.
So today on Energ'Ethic, we explore a question that keeps resurfacing in all the conversations I hear across the energy industry, no matter the trend or the technology. Why is it so hard to build solutions people actually want to use? My guest, Sean Layerle, has spent his entire career trying to answer that question. 14 years in the Silicon Valley, work across 5 continents, roles at Opower and EnerNOC, and now as managing partner at Baalbek Insights, where he supports some of the world's largest energy and tech companies on their most complex digital challenges. Works at the intersection of product management, behavioral science, and data-intensive digital solutions. He helps teams break out their assumption, rethink how users make decisions, and design products that match real human motivations rather than imagined ones. In this conversation, we look at what the energy sector still misunderstands about people, why customer adoption remains a broken promise, and how good product culture can become a lever for a fair and faster energy transition. So we will start with Sean's own journey, shaped by early work in demand-side management and behavioral nudges, and then broaden out to the structural challenges facing energy companies as electrification, flexibility, and distributed resources deployment accelerates. Sean, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Sean. So you spent 14 years in the Silicon Valley before moving into the European energy transition. When you look back, what kind of mindset from that period still guides the way you think about product culture today?
Yeah, I think so. I have lots of very fond memories from that time. I met my spouse in California. Still have lots of friends and some family in California. But I think there are really two things that have stayed with me that are very, very different from a lot of other markets. One is velocity, and the other one is customer centricity. You know, the speed at which things move in California in particular, but in the U.S. as a whole, is really quite different from anywhere else. I think there's a few reasons for that. There's some cultural reasons, which there's a lot of debate as to whether the pendulum swings a little bit too far towards velocity in the U.S., where people. The work-life balance in the US is not the same as the work-life balance that we enjoy in Europe. So it's not to say that it's a, magical, perfect paradigm, but certainly, for tech companies, for energy companies as well, things do move very, very quickly. I go back to the San Francisco area every year for about 5 or 6 weeks, and I'm reminded of this, and it can be very silly little things like the fact that everyone will respond to you in less than 48 hours. So if you email, almost anybody about anything, you're going to get an answer back, either within a day, day and a half. And so even just those little human interactions, things are iterating faster, things are progressing faster, decisions are being made, all the way to bigger topics like just risk, appetite for risk and risk tolerance. I think there's a higher tolerance for failing and potentially failing, in a pretty visible, pretty dramatic manner. And I'm talking about, so it could be at the scale of a team, failing very visibly in front of your team, or failing very visibly in front of the market. Both of those are okay. And so I think, that's something that I try to bring to, certainly to our team, to our projects, to our clients, to help them, move a little bit faster and be a little bit more comfortable taking risks. And again, it could be just as much at the personal level in front of your team. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, to fail, um, to make bad decisions.
Yeah, to
Uh,
try.
exactly. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to is being comfortable to try something
Yeah.
because nobody has a crystal ball. You obviously you make educated decisions, you calculate risk, but no one has a crystal ball. So you have to try something and you have to be ready that maybe it's not going to work exactly the way you planned.
Yeah, it's very much a scientific method, right? You try and you see if the conclusion arrives to what you were expecting or if not. And it's really interesting what you were sharing because indeed this capacity to try, and at the end of the day, it also shows this kind of vulnerability. Like we try, we fail. It's part of life. We are human, and at the same time, well, the Silicon Valley is known to be one of the, let's say, most tech-centric place. It's like it feels almost unhuman, not inhumane, but unhuman given the pace of it, like from an external eye. So it's really interesting what you are saying, that at the end of the day, it's probably one of the most profoundly human place to be, because people dare to be human and dare to fail and dare to try again. And yeah, they made a mistake and it didn't work. They didn't took the right decision, but that's okay. Tomorrow will be another day, right? It's whereas it's true that yeah, in Europe sometimes it feels that okay, you take a bad turn, a bad decision, and then it haunts you for the rest of your life or something.
Yeah. I think there's I'm not a anthropologist, but it would be fascinating to have an
Mhm.
anthropologist perspective on how the cultures have shaped these mentalities. And again, we're talking in generalities. Of course, there are people in Europe that take tons of risk, and
Mhm.
there are amazing entrepreneurs in Europe who move very quickly. And conversely, there are a lot of people in the US who are very risk averse, especially in the energy sector. But speaking in generalities, I think in the US, I remember because obviously I've made lots of mistakes along the way. I've made bad decisions and have experienced, projects that didn't go the way we hoped. And there's a real focus on lessons learned. So people really invite discussion and feedback around, okay, this thing happened. Let's break down why it happened and let's build on that. Let's understand, let's learn, as opposed to I feel like in some of the work environments in Europe, there's a little bit more hesitation because perhaps there's going to be some judgment about, well, why did you make that decision? What mistakes in judgment did you make that led you to have this problem or this difficulty? And it's not, it seems like it comes more at a kind of a nitpicking perspective as opposed to, okay, this was an experience. Let's figure out what we can learn from that experience.
And that's very interesting because that circles back to customer service, trying to what do we learn from this bad experience the consumer had, instead of trying to find the culprit and blame all the chain of command for a mistake, and then leading to immobility, of course, and leading to yeah, perhaps a fear of the negative feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and the second thing that I think the US and I don't want to be too focused on the US because I do see that there are certain markets like the UK or in some Scandinavian countries where this is done very well, but there's a big focus. I think the UK actually does this really well. There's a big culture around customer centricity, focusing on the customer, what customer wants, speaking to them in their language. And I think the way that companies acquire this reflex over time is by digging into those lessons learned, is
Mhm.
by focusing on the problems, focusing on stuff that hasn't worked, having a deep understanding of why it didn't work, and then getting those insights, the customer insights, to understand, okay, well, this is what people misinterpreted, or this is the assumptions we made about the value people were looking for, and those were,
Mhm.
the wrong assumptions. And so we have to shift the value proposition, et cetera.
Yeah. No, that's extremely interesting, and that also like circles back with the work I've been doing with ombudsmen. So the bodies who are in charge of handling the disputes between energy consumers and the suppliers or the energy businesses. And the culture of, let's say, redress in the UK is way stronger than it is in other countries. I mean, where I live in Italy, you have quite a strong culture of litigation. You have a strong culture of complaining, but it's not as structured. And the way you will use the lessons from the mistake is way less structured than the one you find in the UK. And those are only two examples, because I've worked also with ombudsmen in Belgium, in France, and in many different EU countries, actually. So that's very interesting and very, very true what you said. But I would like to circle back to your earlier work. You worked with Opower and then EnerNOC. So this job puts you right inside the third generation of behavioral digital tools for energy, right?
Yeah.
What did those years teach you about how people respond to energy information? What has stayed surprisingly constant?
Yeah. Those experiences were really foundational for me. So in chronological order, I was at EnerNOC, over 15 years ago, I think now. And they were, as far as I know, they were the first company to have a software as a service solution to find energy efficiency improvements in commercial buildings using the building management software. So there's a thing called a BMS that manages all the lights, the heating, cooling, all kinds of different equipment, typically in larger buildings. Increasingly, that's done more and more by a piece of software. And EnerNOC was one of the first companies to figure out that you could build software to run on top of that data, run algorithms on the thousands of data points that you get from all the equipment in the building, and that the algorithms could find energy efficiency opportunities. So it worked quite well. That product still exists in the market today. It's under a company called Measurable. As Silicon Valley goes, there's lots of mergers and acquisitions, but that product is still out there. And what really was a game changer for me was when we started to deploy the first few projects, and we were finding energy efficiency opportunities, but we kept getting these mystery consumption wastes or these
Mm,
mystery consumption excesses that we couldn't explain in the data. And as we talked to the building engineers, the building operators, the staff, we started to find all these anecdotes of, a chess club. This was with a school. There's a chess club that came on Wednesday evenings, and the building schedule would shut down the heating after school was over, and so this chess club would play chess, cold. And so they made friends with one of the janitors who had figured out that if there was a manual override that he could hit with a broomstick, and it would bring the heat back on. And then there's another anecdote about an executive who was staying late, and so the lights were put on for that person, but then that override was never brought back to the usual schedule. And so now you had a building with the lights on 24/7, et cetera,
oops.
et cetera. And as we were finding these things, I started to realize this was the first game changer for me, is that we can't engineer ourselves out of the problem. Like we
Mm,
will have to take into account the human dynamics
yeah.
in the problem, all the human factors, the human element, all these little illogical factors that has to be taken into account somehow. So that
Mm-mm.
was the first moment of clarity where I realized that software by itself or equipment by itself was not going to do the trick. Coincidentally, around that time, around the early 20s, I think, is when Opower was founded. They made a lot of noise very quickly in California, so I knew about them even back when I was at EnerNOC, and they were really the first company to do behavioral science applied at mass market scale
And
to influence.
weren't the one who was saying people think about their energy the way they think about their toilet paper, about 9 minutes per year or something?
Yeah. So originally, so that number originally, to give credit where credit is due, that number originally came from an Accenture survey.
Okay.
So Accenture, I don't know if they still do it today, but Accenture used to do this annual energy consumer survey and report. Shout out to Accenture. And so they had identified this one data point, and Opower, kind of took it and ran with it. But yes, the broader point they had was that, energy is not top of mind for people outside of the energy sector. That's
Yeah.
just a reality. Even post 2022 energy crisis, yes, it's a priority for households, but it's not the number one thing that people think about all the time. So Opower was able to figure out that there's a whole body of academic research that understands how people make decisions and what
Mhm.
drives human behavior. And so they had a crazy idea to say, well, if we have all of these well codified principles, why don't we use that and use that to design the software, use that to design the interventions and to motivate people's behavior specifically on energy, and leverage software to be able to do that across millions and millions of customers. And so that was
Mhm.
the product itself was a pretty huge success. They ended up being acquired by Oracle in 2016, I believe. And
Mm.
so now the product again, still exists, but it exists under a Oracle banner now.
No, that's really, really interesting because that's later something that you brought back to Europe, right? Back to France. Yeah, just for the listeners, you are French and American. You have dual citizenship, so that's why you also have
Yeah.
a very French surname, but a wonderful American accent as well.
I'm undercover. I'm pretty undercover as a French guy. My wife is. She feels like she really got the short end of the stick because she got a French guy who sounds like a Californian. Yeah.
Okay, so you've been back to Europe and you founded a first business, and now you have merged as Baalbek Insights, right? And in your work, you have noticed that the energy sector remains kind of stuck in a tech first reflex. Totally agree with you. That's
Yeah.
really, really kind of maddening to see how much little, let's say, experience is taken into consideration when building something and putting it out there. And yeah, that's why really wanted you on the show because I really want to pick your brain on it. So let's start first with the science. How do you identify when a team is designing around its own assumption rather than its users?
Yeah. There's yeah. So it's there are a few things. I think one thing I would say before answering your question directly is, I have a lot of empathy for the energy sector as a whole, because historically, long planning cycles, risk management, safety, all of those things, especially when energy companies were still vertically integrated, which is still largely the case in the US, not the case in Europe. But you know, it was fundamental to take time, be safe, control risk, etc. And so in the early 2000s, I think, it was still, I had lots and lots of empathy for this tech first reflex and the kind of infrastructure or hardware first reflex. As we get further along into the 2000s, I feel like, it's time to start to accelerate that change. And so to answer your question, there are a few things that we could see right away. Um, which are a bit of a flag for us when we come into a project. The first thing is when we see that the team is really concerned about how can we find ways or find places in the product, in the customer journey, in the emails, whatever it is, to explain things better to customers. So if people are very concerned about where and how Can we better explain things to customers? That's a big flag that they're asking the wrong questions. Because if that's the question you're preoccupied by, that means that you really haven't understood what is actually salient, what's actually important to customers, and you're focused on getting them to understand what is important to you
Yeah.
as an
Yeah.
energy company, as a software company. So that's really the one of the first flags that we see pretty consistently when, companies will ask us, well, we want to launch a flexibility or a demand response service, or a feature inside an app, or a new customer journey to encourage people to participate in demand response events. And so we're trying to figure out, can you help us with behavioral science to explain demand response?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's wrong. It's the wrong question. Fundamentally, that's the wrong
Yeah.
question. There isn't, some behavioral science magic that we can
Yeah.
sprinkle that all of a sudden will make demand
The,
response
the
better.
usual like answer that is being taken by the marketing team. We will be saying, we will do a communication campaign. But very
Right.
often, this communication campaign is not targeted. It's like not going anywhere, not starting on assumption and not going anywhere. So, what would be the right question to ask then?
Yeah. So I think there's one behavioral principle that's very, very useful to be aware of. This was something that was, I think, cataloged for the first time back in the 70s, 1970s. So we're not talking about something that was, discovered last year. So this was, I think, out of Stanford in the 70s, and it's called false consensus bias. And the idea basically is that what we think is normal, we assume everybody also thinks that that's normal. So what we think is intuitive, or even just what I think is intuitive, what I think is pretty, what I think is easy, I'm going to make assumptions and design customer journeys, design products, offerings, whatever it is, based on those assumptions of what I think is logical and intuitive, et cetera. But the thing is, for Marine, that's very different, most
Yeah.
likely. For a customer in Denmark, that's very different, for et cetera, et cetera. So one of the first things that we always try to work with our clients on is to brief them on their own, limitations, yeah, their own biases of how these mental shortcuts that are going to work against them, and try to help them break away. And that usually is a pretty significant quick win, because it helps them think about it. It helps them see how they're being very company centric, even if they have, like, a communication that makes good use of humor, a communication that's very clear, that's very concise. Maybe on paper, everything, the marketing campaign, whatever it is, it looks, it's using all the best practices. It looks very good, but the engagement results are
Yeah.
disappointing. And usually, a lot of times, that's because they're using all the right practices, but they're talking about the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So where we try to help reorient is to try to figure out what is really salient. That's another behavioral notion of what do people perceive as being important for them. So understanding what's going to be salient to them, which usually has nothing to do with the energy company or the tech company, and then focusing on that for the UX, for the customer journey, the offering, whatever it is.
Yeah, so it's really those kind of subtle choices that you call salient points. They can be linked to wording, timing, framing. There are probably way more, but can you share an example where, a small design decision or where you helped a client and that transformed adoption or engagement?
Yeah, sure. Well, there are a couple of examples I can think of. One of the things that's really interesting is that it is really a case by case thing. So there isn't like a magical playbook where if you use this behavioral principle or that behavioral principle, all of a sudden, you're going to double your engagement or whatever. It really is a matter of understanding what's going to be salient for customers in the specific context that um, of that journey, of that product, whatever it is. There's a startup that we've been doing a lot of help, we've been giving a lot of help to in France called Liberté Watt. They're a direct to consumer demand response app.
Yeah.
So they don't work through energy retailers. When we first started working with them, just like every well-intentioned player in the energy sector, one of the first questions they asked us is there's a certain way that we have to monetize demand response with the TSO, with the transmission system operator. So in order to trade that demand response in the market, it needs to behave a certain way. So how do we explain that? Can you help us explain that to customers? And of course, my answer is that you can't. There's no way that you will ever have the time or the attention span to be able to explain any of that to your
Mm.
users. They had been pulling their hair out, they had all these different versions and all these different approaches. And again, they were like the design was very good. The language
Mhm.
was funny. Like, they were doing everything right in terms of the cosmetic aspects, but they were focused on the wrong thing. So what we
Yeah.
did was, so Liberté Watt, and again, it has to be specific to the product. So Liberté Watt, they reward customers for participating in demand response events with points, and those points, they have a bunch of partnerships with retailers, like electronics or gyms or whatever, and those points will convert to gift cards to buy AirPods or whatever. So what they've done is they've really made it all about gamification
Mm.
to be able to win as many points as possible, to be able to convert, these points. So what we said was, look, what is salient to someone who's coming and using your app is not the market mechanisms to monetize demand response. It's not what's salient to them. What's salient to them is, how do I win as many points as possible so that I can get a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So what we completely changed the way they were thinking about the customer journey and made it focused on getting customers to play as quickly as possible. So when you think about a video game, there's no big explanation about all the universe around the video game and who all the characters
Mm.
are and all the different levels. They just get you to play. They get
Yeah.
you to start playing, and you learn as you start playing.
Yeah.
So that's really what we focused on, is how can we pull people into the UX as quickly as possible and get them to start earning points and get them to start, participating in events, getting
Yeah.
feedback, and get them engaged. So Liberté Watt, I think now they're just a couple of years old, but I think they passed like 30,000 users or something like that. So they've had a really, really rapid growth as far as, demand response in France could hope to grow. They've done really well, especially given that they're not tied to any particular energy retailer. But that was one example. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting also, because can make comparisons with the other sectors, like I don't know, I use Duolingo for languages, and I don't usually play video games, but I'm very addicted to Duolingo, and how I have this mini rewards, like points for absolutely nothing, and just
Yeah,
play
yeah,
with friends and so on. And yeah, indeed, it's like very easy, very annoying for the people in the room who are not playing with me on Duolingo, but that makes it that makes it fun and entertaining. And at the end of the day, the method itself is efficient, but it's also like the universe that they put together that is efficient, right? So it's really working on both, let's say, both streams. But I guess that it also took them to make a nice step back to understand that what they wanted at the end of the day was for people to come back to the app, and not
yeah.
only like use it once, but come back to it and see where the salient points were. And yeah, I find it quite yeah, indeed, in Liberty Watts, I don't live in France, so I haven't used it, but I've seen a little bit the platform, and it looks really cool compared to many other things I have seen elsewhere. I'm like, not bad, guys.
Yeah, yeah. And I like that example because it's, demand response. I mean, even the name demand response, those two words together, I always thought, it's a terrible name
It
because
is.
because
It
yes,
is.
yes, technically it's the response of electric demand to the needs of the grid, but it's a terrible name, and it's not going to be natural or intuitive to
Yeah.
anyone. And we can see a lot of retailers, especially in Europe, specific to Europe, since 2022, definitely has been an inflection point on all things to do with flexibility and demand response in particular. And we do see a lot of companies struggling to figure out, again, like how do we explain demand response? But I fundamentally believe that's the wrong question. It's the
Yeah.
wrong thing to focus on.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember delivering a training in South Africa a few years ago, and I was explaining demand response by just putting on the screen a yoga figure where you really need to have your balance. Like you have the electricity on the one hand, you have the house in the one hand, and you need to make them match. And that's like a position of yoga. If you stand on one foot, you need to have a balance at the center. You need to find, and that's and all the students were like, we had heard about it, but we never knew what it was. And it's like, yeah, but yeah, it's not explaining to 5 years old, but almost, yeah. Sometimes if you
uh,
address,
but even, the difficulty in the digital world is that, even the small interaction that you had with those individuals, finding the space to be able to do that in a digital product or in a digital customer experience is really hard. Like, because
mm,
people are not going to sit through like a long tutorial. And when I say long tutorial, again, in the digital world, a long tutorial could be like 2 or 3 screens. That could already start to feel like it's a lot. So that's really why efficiency of really understanding what's salient to people and just going as quickly as possible to and efficiently as possible to what's salient for people that's the key. Because especially when we're talking about energy and demand response, people are not
yeah.
naturally curious about this kind of stuff.
No, but I've seen recently also Engie in France launching a campaign or a new tariff called Happy Hours. So basically, you
Hmm.
have 2 hours of 2 hours where you have very cheap electricity price because you don't pay for the electricity, just for the tax and everything. But it's like framing it as happy hours. You don't pay electricity for a couple of hours. I mean, that's so straightforward. Like everybody
Yeah,
kind of knows what a happy hour is. Heures heureuses in French, of course, because
yeah,
in
yeah,
French you need to translate what it is. But that makes it very really really easy to understand because it's relatable to other like concepts, other frameworks again. And yeah, I find it interesting that finally the the energy sector is starting to look at what is being done in other sectors to kind of attract and make sure that customers or people are really part of it and not an afterthought. And now we are not even talking about the different, let's say, categories of the population who cannot engage for a variety of reasons, who are not digitally confident either. So that would be
yeah.
another topic of conversation. But yeah, I think that's really cool that people like you are able to, yeah, to bring this clarity when building this kind of tools.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things it's fascinating to me now is, as we accelerate into the era of flexibility, things like this, so that, this happy hour offer and everything around different vehicle to grid offers, smart charging offers, all these things, the acceleration of flexibility is opening up a whole new array of potential offers. And I think that's super exciting because so at Baalbek, we have a practice area around digital solutions that we've talked a lot about. We also have a practice area in data science. So about 2/3 of the team have PhDs in things like physics, mathematics, battery chemistry, even. And so we do some pretty intense data science work. And what we're seeing is on the topic of optimization, of flexibility, there's a really fascinating convergence of those two topics because on the science side, obviously there's a lot of work to do to optimize, if we're talking about residential between either just aggregated demand response or for those customers, which is not everybody, but those customers who have PV vehicles, storage, the optimization of that has a lot of technical complexity. We've worked at the grid scale as well, and so there's a ton of complexity there. But ultimately, there are customer experiences that have to be attached to that. And so the NG example you gave is a great example. So where they're doing that pretty well. But I think a lot of players are still very focused on, look at all these ways that we can control your electric vehicle. And it's like, well, that's really cool for us that are inside the energy sector, but that's not necessarily what's going to be salient to people. People is, are you going to charge my car for free?
Yeah.
That's something I'm much more interested in, and I'm much more willing to hear about your value proposition if you're telling me that, if you give me access to your car, you can have free charging, X number of days per year or whatever the case might be.
Not even mentioning how daunting the word control can be.
Yeah.
I worked on different cases where basically there was a proposal to install some devices to monitor, so that was presented as control, the consumption of the home. Of course, no one wanted that, but
Yeah.
they were okay to get some monitoring, but control was absolutely off limit. So it's also this kind of mindset that needs changing. I mean, yeah, I think it's really interesting that, you're able to blend all this data analysis, and it's not only about collecting more data, but collecting better data with really implementation. And so what are the next steps with the Baalbek Insights now?
Well, so, we've been lucky. I wish we could say that we had the vision to go after this, but actually our clients brought us onto topics of flexibility about 5-6 years ago, because they were more forward thinking than us. But the result now is that, we have 5-6 years of experience doing a lot of things that companies are trying to figure out now. So, optimizing flexibility in commercial buildings that have more vehicle charging, more PV, more storage, doing that for cities, and then obviously doing it on the residential front as well. Whether it's the customer experience or the algorithms behind all that optimization, we already have 5-6 years of things that have been in market, that are working, that we've built for clients because, fundamentally we're a consulting company. So we don't own the IP. Our clients own the IP. So that's really, the current acceleration of flexibility is what we're super excited about because, again, there's that convergence of the technical complexity, but having to take that away from customers as much as possible. We can't put all this technical complexity on them. We're not going to be able to explain all this to them. So we have to figure out better customer experiences, better products to be able to get the most out of all the opportunities that are present with flexibility.
So cool. Thank you so much, Sean. It's been like such a pleasure to have you here in the pod. I feel that I've learned a lot. And yeah, I think it's a great way to start 2026 to see that, it's possible to break frontiers between the various disciplines. And yeah, there is science, there is very hard science with the part that you're extremely excited about. And yeah, on the show, you've also heard some people talk about social sciences and of course, even philosophy. So it's all blends really, really well together. Thank you, Sean, for being the first guest of this new year of Energ'Ethic, and Happy New Year. And all the best for with the Baalbek Insights. So it's a new project. It's a continuity, but yeah, I'm looking forward to see how it unfolds.